Welcome to this lecture. We would be covering some of the important topics of biopsychology as I had mentioned before. Now what we would be covering today is nervous system and neurons, the structure and the function of neurons. We will be covering the topic of neural impulse in a separate lesson. Now let's start with nervous system. When I talk about nervous system, we can explain nervous system into two basic components, that is the CNS and the PNS. We call it the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. Now simply extended, central nervous system comprises of brain and spinal cord. We have already talked about the detailed lecture on brain and the components of brain. So CNS comprises of simply merely stating the brain and the spinal cord. Now moving on to peripheral nervous system. Peripheral nervous system is composed of two major elements, that's the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. And this autonomic nervous system is further subdivided into sympathetic and parasympathetic. Now let's understand first of all what are the two basic components of peripheral nervous system, that's the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. Now what we will do throughout this lecture is we will take some simple examples to help understand the concepts, and then we will move with the real structure and the real understanding of the real scientific structure of neurons. Now let's say you have 4 kids playing in the garden. Now the first kid tells everyone, let's jump. So what happens is all the 4 kids together start to jump, and that movement of jumping is a kind of somatic movement which is activated by the somatic nervous system, which sends and receives message from the sense organ to the skeletal muscles, and this is 100% voluntary in nature. If I want, I will jump, if I don't, I won't. So that means this is governed by what is known as the striated muscles. On the other hand, there are some phenomena that happen involuntarily. For example, if I am jumping continuously, what would happen is my heart rate would increase, I might perspire. So all these are involuntary actions that happen, and these involuntary actions are also called as self-governing actions. And under autonomic nervous system, we understand that messages are delivered to and from the internal organ and the glands. As a result, since they are involuntary in nature, they are controlled by smooth muscles. So that is the basic categorization under the peripheral nervous system. As I said, we classify those as somatic nervous system and autonomic nervous system. Now this autonomic nervous system is further subdivided into two components, that is sympathetic and parasympathetic. Now I will repeat once again, you have the nervous system that is classified into two, which is the CNS, the central nervous system, and the peripheral nervous system. This central comprises of brain and spinal cord. You have the peripheral, which comprises of somatic system and autonomic nervous system. This autonomic is further subdivided into sympathetic and parasympathetic. So now we would understand the autonomic nervous system in detail, which is the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. Now in simple terms, if I say sympathetic nervous system activates the body, on the other hand parasympathetic cools down the body or brings the body to a base level, and in other words I could say it lowers the arousal. On the other hand, sympathetic activates the body. So you have accelerated heartbeat, you would have dilated lungs branching that could be seen, it would stimulate the glucose release. But all the phenomena that happen under sympathetic nervous system are like constellation of effects. It's not just that your heart rate would increase. It would be all your internal organs would start to work at a faster pace. Again, when we talk about the sympathetic nervous system, the messages is not directly delivered from the spinal cord. the messages are carried forward to a chain of sympathetic ganglia, and from there you have the various organs that are stimulated. On the other hand, for parasympathetic, they are directly affected by the spinal cord itself. Now, the sympathetic nervous system is also the state where we call it as fight or flight response. So, it's a stage of fight or flight response, and it's a kind of emergency state that is addressed. On the other hand, parasympathetic, as I said, lowers the arousal, quietens the body. Now, when we talk about nerves and nervous system, there are few basic differences. We have already talked about what is nervous system. Now, nervous system is composed of numerous nerves, and those nerves are made up of neurons. So, you have neurons which are tiny as compared to nerves, first of all. And here under parasympathetic and sympathetic, one more difference. As I said, there is constellation of effect that is seen under sympathetic. However, parasympathetic targets single organ or small sets of organs, in contrast to what happens under sympathetic. Now, nerves and neurons, coming back to it, nerves are big. Nerves are, I can say, bundles of neuron fibers, and those bundles of neuron fibers are known as axons, and these are known as axons. However, neurons are smaller in size, they are much more tiny in nature. Now, when we talk about brain, you have certain cranial nerves that move from brain and they affect the various organs. There are 12 major cranial nerves that we talk about and that you must remember. So, you have the 12 major cranial nerves that are given. Now, I have highlighted the areas that are affected by each of these nerves, and in the bracket we have written either S or M. S stands for sensory and M stands for motor. We will later on see what does sensory and motor means. In simple terms, if I say sensory is from the say a finger is, my finger is pricked by a pin. So, the response that goes from my finger to the brain would be sensory, and back from the brain to the finger would be motor, and that motor neuron, motor response would tell me to remove my finger. So, that's a kind of sensory and motor responses that work. So, we have marked which nerves are sensory and which are motor, and which are both sensory and motor. So, you have olfactory that deals with the smell, optic that deals with hearing, and so on and so forth. So, you have the list here, you have to know and memorize this list. Now, next is the important concept that we would be focusing in today's class, that is neurons. Now, as I said, nerves are made up of neuron. So, we need to understand individual neuron and the structure of neuron. Before we go on that, let's talk about the types of neuron. As I said, sensory neurons and motor neurons. So, sensory neurons receive input from the sense organs. So, that is input from eyes, nose, touch responses. So, all those are sensory responses. On the other hand, motor neurons stimulate the muscles and the movement. So, when my finger is pricked, I move my finger away from the pin. So, that response is a kind of response that is generated by motor neuron. Then there are neurons in between which connect in between the sensory and the motor neurons, and they kind of have a web which is known as interconnection, and those are known as interneurons. Finally, the most important of those is the glial cells, and this is where questions are asked off and on. Now, these glial cells take care of neuron, as it was believed till long that glial cells are responsible for feeding the main neuron structures. However, later on it was established that these glial cells provide connections among various neurons, and finally it was discovered that they are 10 times more in number as compared to the neurons. So, you have at least 10 times more glial cells that are present in contrast to neurons. Now, understanding the structure of neuron, I want you to understand the structure of neuron in a kind of very simple example, because I have seen students getting confused with what message comes in, what message goes out, and how the neuron structure works around. Now, you have a chain of students who are playing together. Okay, so what they are doing is they are standing hand in hand. Now, there is a message that is to be conveyed from the first child to the last child. How that would happen is through the series of steps which are the intermediate boys. So, the person who is receiving the message acts as dendrite. So, when we talk about the structure of neuron, so this is within the structure of neuron. So, all these are components of structure of neuron. You should be very clear. Now, dendrite is one that receives the signal. The whole of the section of center boys would be considered as the cell body or the neuron, the main neuron, and finally you have the axon which sends the signal out. And that axon would be the last boy who is standing in the row, who would be sending the signal out or transmitting the signal. Now, the interesting thing is this axon is covered by a thick layer of fat tissue, and that fatty tissue is known as myelin sheath. So, this axon, the last boy, is surrounded by a layer of fat cell, and that is known as myelin sheath, and that governs the process of transmission. Now, you have the structure of neuron as you have seen, but there are two sets of neurons that are line in line. That means you have the dendrite of one, then the axon of one, and here starts the dendrite of one, and finally the axon of another. So, you have this neuron that exists and you have another neuron that works around with this neuron. So, what is happening here is there is a kind of connection between neuron 1 and neuron 2, and that connection where they two interact is known as the synapse. So, the region where neuron 1 interacts with the second neuron is known as synapse. The intermediately filled space here, which is a kind of empty space I would be saying, or the intermediate states between the dendrites and the axons merging, would be known as the synaptic cleft. So, these two diagrams were meant to understand or to provide a basic formulation of what exactly is the structure of neuron and how that works. Now, there are two ways in which the signal can work for each child. First is the normal electrical impulse that I would say, which we cover under the neural impulse, where we talk about the sodium potassium exchange. So, that's the action pump we talk about. Now, this person can clap this person's hand, then this person can clap this person's hand and transmit the information to the last person, considering clapping as some form of electrical impulse. On the other hand, there could be another way of transmitting information. The other way could be this person has something sticky in hand and he sticks the same persons to the next person and moves on. So, that would be a kind of chemical message that is transferred. So, when we talk about neurons, there are two types of messages that work around simultaneously. So, you have the electrical impulse that goes on and the chemical impulse that goes on. Now, this is where we talk about the structure of neuron. You have the basic cell body surrounded by the cell membrane. You have dendrites that are linked to the cell body, and then you have a kind of long axon which is covered by the myelin sheath. So, this whole axon is covered by the myelin sheath, and towards the end of the axon you have the terminal buttons, and these terminal buttons release neurotransmitters, and these neurotransmitters are the chemical signals that are sent in. Again, as I said, you have the axon terminals or the terminal buttons. We call it both as axon terminals and terminal buttons. They release the neurotransmitters, and this is the next dendrite of the next neuron that comes into phase. So, the region where they merge is the synapse, and the intermediate region, as you can see, is the synaptic cleft. We have understood all the components. It's just a formal diagram of neuron that we are putting in here to elaborate the concept. Now the next is how information moves. I already explained how the information works around. So there can be there would be either a kind of electrical impulse or a chemical response. Now the electrical impulse or the neural impulse would be discussed in a separate session because we will be talking about the action pump in detail. So it is primarily electrical in nature for now. There is communication between the two neurons, which is chemical and which is considered by neurotransmitters. Now these neurotransmitters work in two ways. Either they excite the next neuron or they inhibit. So either they will excite the next neuron or they would reduce or decrease the work of the next neuron or decrease the strength of the signal, in better words I would say. So nerve impulse works with the electrically charged molecules which are known as ions, which exist inside the neurons, and then we will understand the action potential in detail. Now the working of neurotransmitters. Neurotransmitters work like a lock and key. So the chemical message that comes in is the key to open the lock, that is receptor. So these neurotransmitters act as a key to open the path for the receptors, and what happens basically is if the total excitatory input that is coming in is much more or much higher as compared to inhibitory input, it would lead to more of action potential, and since it would be more of action potential, it would cause the neuron to fire. We will understand the action potential and firing when we will talk about all and none event in the class on neural impulse. So this is the basic concept that works with neurotransmitters. Now for today's class, what is most important is the major neurotransmitters, their mode of action and their deficiency and excess. Now there are sometimes straightforward questions that are asked on the deficiency of, for example, acetylcholine would lead to. So your answer would be Alzheimer's. Again there can be question is, if GABA occurs in excess, what would happen? So that would lead to sleeping or eating disorders. So there can be exact direct questions based on this single table. So you should have this single table by heart. Now what I have tried to explain here is 7 of the major neurotransmitters, 4 of which are excitatory and 3 of which are inhibitory. So serotonin, GABA and endorphin are inhibitory in action. However, norepinephrine, glutamate, dopamine and acetylcholine are excitatory in nature. Now you have to understand few of the major impacts. So you have deficiency of acetylcholine leads to Alzheimer's, deficiency of dopamine leads to Parkinson's, excess of dopamine leads to schizophrenia, then you have excess of serotonin that causes autism. So these are some of the major excess and deficiencies that you must know. So those which I have highlighted are the most important ones. However, you must remember all of these. Now moving on to some other important terminologies as far as nervous system is concerned. So first of that is neuropeptides. What are neuropeptides? So neuropeptides are brain chemicals that regulate the activity of other neurons that exist in the body. So these brain chemicals, they do not carry the message directly. They are basically in two forms, enkephalins and endorphins. So enkephalins are opiate-like regulators which tend to decrease the pain and the stress level, and similar work is done by endorphin, but this endorphin is released by pituitary gland. So you have these two as the major components of neuropeptides, and the major function of neuropeptide is to regulate the activity of other neurons. Now the next is the neural network. Now this is something which is very important to understand. Each neuron that exists in our body or is a part of the nerve is a kind of tiny computer that exists, and there are billions of neurons and millions of trillions of synapses that occur within the human body. So if a signal moves from pricking of my hand to my brain, it comprises of numerous and numerous neurons. It's not just that one single neuron goes through. So it's a kind of neural network that exists. So to understand that neural network, there is one very important concept, which is weight. Now, how will we understand this weight? For example, there are 3 friends which go out for shopping. You have friend A, B and C. Now, friend A has to buy certain commodity, let's say X, Y and Z from the market. Friend C has extreme negative views about that commodity and strongly say not to buy it. However, friend B strongly recommends the commodity. And this friend B is also among one of the best friends of A. Now what would the friend A do? That's the question that comes in. Now consider or apply this question to yourself. What would happen in such a circumstances? Friend B would have a weightage over friend C because of the 2 reasons. First of all, friend B is one of the closest friends or best friends of A, and he or she has a very strong support for this commodity and a kind of strong views, a positive sentiment for this. So the weight of friend B would exceed the weight of friend C. As a result, the input from friend B would outweigh the input from friend C. Similar happens in our nervous system. Similar phenomena when we study, so you have 5 signals that are coming in here. You have 2 negative signals but 3 positive signals, and of which 1 positive is very strong. What would happen? This strongly positive signal would overweigh the 2 negative signals, and ultimately you would have a positive response that would flow in, and ultimately what would flow out from A would be a positive response, considering the fact that this person A would buy the commodity XYZ. So what happens, what is the basic idea to understand this is, one neuron may weigh hundreds of inputs and that weightage would outweigh the weight of the other inhibitory signals that are coming in. Now, to process this, you have a reflex arc that works in, and that reflex arc works in a similar fashion. For example, if I am pricked by a pin, I would have 1,000 times much probability to withdraw my hand as to not withdraw my hand. So what is happening here is, you have a kind of reflex arc which is shown, and this diagram clearly illustrates the pricking of pin, and you have the activation of the sensory neuron. This sensory neuron takes the signal to the CNS. This information is being processed in the CNS, and then you have a connector neuron which links the sensory neuron and the motor neuron, which is linked by the connector neuron, and this motor neuron finally sends the signal back to the hand, and at the hand you have the effector muscle or the effector response that works in, and finally the person withdraws the hand. So this is a kind of reflex arc that works. Now finally, the most important concept again, there are 2 terms which are commonly being heard of. One is neuroplasticity and another is neurogenesis. When I say neuroplasticity, it means with growing age or advancing age, the concept that the brain deteriorates is not perfect. I would say that with advancing age, the capacity of brain to change with response to experience increases. Let's say, for example, a rat is kept in an extreme situation. What would happen? That rat would struggle to get the food, and when it's struggling, it's trying to work out more and more complex phenomena. As a result, it would lead the rat's brain to have much longer dendrites, much more detailed synapses. So if you are left into a complex situation, you would automatically strive forward to achieve it. And however, in certain circumstances it is said that human brain is not that neuroplastic as compared to other brains, but still with patience and persistence, human brain could be modified, or by exposure to the external experiences, the capacity of brain could change. Considering these concept of neuroplasticity, there was a rule that was propounded by Hebb, which was known as Hebb's rule, and he extended the concept that repeated activation of synapse between two neurons strengthens the connection between them. So if there is a kind of repeated interaction that is occurring, repeated activation that is working on, it would strengthen the connection between the two neurons. The next final concept is neurogenesis. Again, till late it was believed that the human brain deteriorates. However, the concept of neurogenesis explains the growth of new neurons and production of new brain cells that occur with the advancing age. Now, to explain or assist this, there was an experiment that was conducted, and later on it was considered as one of the therapies in psychology, which was known as the constraint induced movement therapy. Now, what was the basic idea of this constraint induced movement therapy? Suppose a person has a left hand impaired. So if the left hand is impaired, what would happen? The person would have a kind of constraint to use the left hand because of the impairment that he is facing. However, if I constrain his right hand also, what he would do is, since now he is not able to work even with his right hand, he will try to work something out from his left hand. As a result, there would be developments that would be seen back into the left hand. So if you constrain the other hand to an extent that the person is not able to use right hand to do certain work, he will automatically try his best to work around or to lead to some solution in case to resolve at least his day-to-day issues with the left hand. And that concept later on was propounded as constraint induced movement therapy. So when you have constraint that you have introduced to your body, you would automatically see the movement that would come into the left hand. So with this we cover the class on nervous system and neurons. We will be covering a next lesson where we will be talking about nervous impulse and the action potential action pump. You can subscribe to our channel for more lectures on psychology and physiology. Have a good day ahead.